North Korea, the North Korean army, comes sweeping across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack on South Korea. South Korea wasn't expecting this. Okay, they were completely unawares. They were caught with their pants down, as they say, and they were completely overwhelmed and driven backward immediately, all the way back to a small area around the city of Busan. Be careful with that one. Busan. Okay, you know where Busan is because you identified it on your map. That's why I asked you to mark this on your map. It's because it's significant. Busan is a city in South Korea all the way on the coast. So in just a tiny perimeter right around Busan, the entire South Korean people are, not every single South Korean, but the government and many of the citizens were cornered. And they were really, really close. Just look at the map, right? Really close to being overrun, to being defeated by North Korea. They were desperate, the South Koreans were, for help. So they asked the United States, of course, to intervene. And the United States proved willing to help, but they wanted to bring the UN into the situation. Okay? So the United States went to the United Nations and asked the nations, all of the nations of the world who are in the United Nations, to band together and to come to the aid of South Korea to help them fight off the North Koreans. And the UN agreed. Okay, so the countries of the UN voted and agreed to send military aid, troops, to Korea. This is the Korean War. So something like 27 different countries sent troops. The United States, by far, sent the most troops. So technically, this is a UN peace called a police action. Technically, it wasn't even a war. War was not declared on North Korea. This was called a police action. But in reality, it's by far mostly the United States Army who goes to Korea to help the South Koreans defeat the North Koreans. The American Army was led by a man named Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur, who was an experienced general from World War II. He was the commander in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia during World War II, a highly decorated, high-ranking, very capable general. So, MacArthur was the one, as the commander of the American troops, he's the one who came up with the brilliant plan. His strategy was to, rather than land the U.S. Army at Busan, right, in the southeast, which seems like it would make sense, right? If you're going to come to the aid of South Korea, this is where you go if you're the U.S. Army. Instead, what MacArthur decides to do is this really interesting and dangerous and high-risk tactic of landing at a place called Incheon, which is also another one that you're familiar with, Incheon. The city of Incheon on the west coast, all the way up here. So you see the blue arrow here. The landing in September at Incheon. Why did MacArthur, what do you suppose? I hope you can see, it should be pretty obvious just by looking at the map, what MacArthur's thinking was. What's he trying to do here? Right. And if this works, what will happen? Well, yes, but even before that. I mean, if the U.S. Army, if a huge force lands here successfully, first of all, they could take Seoul, right? Seoul is the capital. Right? You know that as well, because you marked it on the map. So the capital of South Korea is Seoul. So that's big. But then also, what if they continue to move this way? What will happen to the North Korean army? They'll be cut off from their country. They'll be surrounded, right? They'll have the U.S. Army in behind them. They'll have the South Koreans to the south. They'll be in deep doo-doo, right? That technical term that we always use in history class. Deep doo-doo. Anytime you can surround your enemy, right, in war, that's like the ultimate goal. Now, if this goes wrong, the United States is themselves in deep doo-doo. It's a very dangerous thing to do, but he pulls it off. The U.S. lands at Incheon. They capture Seoul. They capture I think the book says about half of the North Korean army. And the North Koreans suddenly are in a panic. They are absolutely freaked out. So they are forced, because of the successful landing at Incheon, the North Koreans are forced to flee back up across the 38th parallel into North Korea in a hurry, right? They're hightailing it. They're in retreat, full-blown panicked retreat, running, racing northwards to avoid being trapped, to avoid being encircled. So first, it's a North Korean invasion into the south, and then there's a response, and the south pushes the north up back across the 38th, but they don't stop. Okay, rather than stopping at the 38th, the South Koreans, the Americans, the UN, they continue to drive North Korea up into further and further into North Korea, right? So you see the arrows on the map here, the blue arrows. This is the blue response, pushing all the way to Pyongyang, the capital, and even further north, all the way up toward the Yalu River. The Yalu River. This river is the border between North Korea and China. So now, all of a sudden, China is interested in they had always been paying close attention to this fighting, but now the fighting is on their doorstep, right? It looks like there's a possibility that the U.S. Army and the UN and the South Koreans might just keep going, pushing across the Yalu River into China itself. So now China is alarmed by the situation. And in fact, General Douglas MacArthur, this is kind of a side drama, he wanted to drop nuclear weapons on China. Truman fortunately told him no. But there was some thought among the Americans that maybe this is an opportunity to push into China and maybe turn China, back into a non-communist nation. Who knows? Anyway, China gets pulled into this because of the way that the war goes back and forth, back and forth. So the Chinese send in troops. They're feeling threatened. They send a wave of something like 300,000 troops across the Yalu into North Korea. A massive wave of soldiers. 300,000 Chinese communist soldiers swoop down across the Yalu into North Korea to help the North Koreans. Now, again, this is like a metronome, right? It's swinging back and forth. Now, all of a sudden, it's the Americans and the South Koreans who are forced to turn tail and retreat because they're being pushed back southward again. In fact, they were pushed again down past 38th. Yet again. Back and forth they go, right? In the end, that is by 1953, both sides, having suffered tremendously. We're sort of skipping over some of the details, but the fighting in the Korean War was really terrible. Okay, I don't know if you know anything about North Korea or the Korean Peninsula, but it's very cold in the winter. They had a Winter Olympics in Pyongyang, last year or whatever it was. Brutal conditions, brutal fighting. Neither side wants to continue. The suffering is becoming unbearable, and so by 1953, both sides agree to a ceasefire and a border at the 38th parallel. They agree to quit fighting, basically, both sides. And they agree there'll be a border, a national border between the two at the 38th parallel. So, the aftermath of the war, what does it all mean? There's a couple of things to say in conclusion here. And to put this in the context of the Cold War. First of all, this is the Truman Doctrine in action, right? Remember the Truman Doctrine, where Truman said that the United States policy would be to come to the aid of any countries in the world who are trying to prevent themselves from being taken over by communists. That's exactly what this situation is. It's South Korea trying to prevent themselves from being taken over by the communists. The United States comes to their aid. In other words, the United States follows the Truman Doctrine. This is the doctrine of containment. Remember, that's the big word that describes what the U.S. is doing in the Cold War. trying to contain the spread of communism. Okay, the communist North Koreans tried to spread, this is where this war started, right? Tried to spread into the South. And the United States tried to prevent that. Okay, that's containment. So this is a great example of the Cold War in action. The result of the war in the end was a stalemate. Okay, I want you to know this word, stalemate. Stalemate. It's a draw. A tie. There's a Latin phrase for it. Status quo ante bellum. Status quo ante bellum. The state of things before the war is what that means. Status quo ante bellum. So what was the outcome of the war? The outcome was the state of things before the war. And that makes sense, right? Given what you know about this. Korea looks exactly like it did when the war started. That is, divided north and south, communist north, capitalist south, divided at the 38th parallel. Okay, it's a stalemate. Korea today, if you don't know, remains divided at the 38th parallel. Korea looks like this today. Communist north, non-communist south. Okay, but this is a great example of how the Cold War worked. And we're going to look at a couple of other examples. We're going to look at the Vietnam War. We're going to look at Cuba and some other incidents. And you'll see some patterns here as we go along. All right. Questions about this? Okay.